Hey, how's it going everybody? Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. If you clicked on this video, you probably know what the topic is. Today we're going to be talking about Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice. If you watched my Man of Steel video from a few weeks ago, you know that I'm going through the DCEU right now. And this is the second movie, and we're finally here. I watched this movie maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago at time of recording, and that was my second ever watch. I watched it for the first time in like 2016 or 2017, probably 2016. And I gotta say, I did not remember big chunks of this movie. But before we get into all that, let's just address the elephant in the room with this movie. This movie is immensely hated by some people. And the general consensus of this movie is that it's not very good. And my opinion on it has changed, I will say, since the first time I saw it. I don't necessarily think people's criticisms of this movie are invalid. This movie definitely does deserve most of the criticism it receives, and I am also one of those people who will criticize this movie because it definitely has some deep flaws. The biggest problem I have with Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice is the same problem I have with the DCEU as a whole. They tried to bite off way more than they could chew too early. We should have gotten a standalone Ben Affleck Batman movie before we got a crossover event type movie. What happened was the heads of Warner Brothers saw what Marvel was doing and they wanted a piece of it without putting in the work. If you look at Marvel did 2 standalone Iron Man movies, The Incredible Hulk, Captain America, The First Avenger, Thor, all before the first Avengers movie. And sure, they didn't give a standalone movie to every Avenger. They didn't give one to Hawkeye, and they didn't give one to Black Widow until just a few years ago. But the thing is, with building up a crossover event, is that we're connected to most of these characters already. At the very least, we've seen Hawkeye in Thor briefly, and we've seen Black Widow in Iron Man 2. And so we have at least mild familiarity even with the smaller group members, and we have standalone movies for the main ones. And now I know this isn't Justice League, this is just Batman vs Superman, but at the same time, you're throwing in a Batman that nobody has any real emotional connection to and trying to pit him against a Superman that we do know from his own solo movie. And the problem with that is you can't just throw Batman in there and expect people to, relate to this Batman, to feel for this Batman. You can't just assume people know the character from other movies or comics, because that's not how it works. You have to build a connection with this actual specific character. Now, I know most comic book fans already have a connection with Batman in some form, whether it be through comics or through video games or through other live action portrayals or animated portrayals that we've had in the past. But you can't just bank on that. You have to set this character up for your universe. You can't take shortcuts like that, especially when you're trying to build a shared universe like they were trying to do. You can't take shortcuts, and you can't set that precedent of we don't have to set these characters up for people to care, because you do have to set them up for people to care. So unfortunately, in Batman vs Superman, we have a Batman that is more tell than show. We hear things about his past, we hear things about, how long he's been at it, but it would have been nice to see that. You would have more connection with him if you saw that. The only real backstory you get for Batman in this movie is the opening credits. And while the opening credits are beautiful and they tell that story we've had before in a quick, efficient way, Batman is more than just his childhood fear of bats. There's more to the Batman origin story than just him as a kid. Most of his adult life is the origin story. His training is the origin story. His first few years as Batman and encountering these villains for the first time builds his character. And we kind of got robbed of that with the DCEU. But while we're on the topic of Batman, let's talk about another problem I have with this movie. Zack Snyder doesn't really understand the character of Batman. And I know there are some Snyder fans out there who don't like to hear that. But in my opinion, at least, it's true. Especially with recent interviews that I've seen of him talking about the character of Batman, he doesn't seem to understand that Batman doesn't kill and why he doesn't kill. Zack Snyder has recently said that it's not interesting to him to have a character like Batman who doesn't kill or isn't pushed into killing. But that's just the whole character of Batman, is that he doesn't kill. There's no need to put him in a situation where he has to kill. And if you wanted to put him in that situation to make a really tough decision, whether to kill or not to kill to save lives, that would be an interesting story. But in Batman vs. Superman, we have Batman blowing people up. I'm not talking about, stabbing people with a knife or beating people till they're probably, brain dead. But I'm talking about him actually shooting rockets at a truck and blowing them up. Those people are eviscerated. And there was no need for that. They just did that, I don't know, because it looked cool, because Zack Snyder wanted it to happen, but there was honestly really no need for him to kill those people. And on top of him killing Lex Luthor's henchmen, the whole movie kind of circulates around this idea that Batman's gonna fight Superman, and he doesn't want to fight him, he wants to kill him. And to me, that really just feels like jumping the gun. I know that Superman and Zod were responsible for many casualties. On Superman's side, it wasn't intentional. On Zod's side, it was. And Batman doesn't really know that. It's kind of, hearsay, his own, experience of what he saw and what he's heard. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like a very Batman thing to do to kill Superman just because he could be a threat. There was one line in the movie that said, I believe he said that if there's even a 1% chance that this man's our enemy, we have to take action. It kind of feels like you're jumping the gun. Maybe get kryptonite and then wait and see a little bit longer. There's been one instance that you think that Superman was responsible for a lot of death. And sure, it was catastrophic. But at the same time, you see what else he's done in these years surrounding. I know there was the whole thing in the desert and it was a setup and made it look like Superman was a bad guy, but come on, you're Batman. Look into it a little bit more before you try to stab someone. But yeah, that's just another thing. It's kind of the beginnings of people's kind of distrust in Zack Snyder's handling of the DCEU. And in my opinion, it's justified. When you have a character like Batman, an integral part of the DCEU and of DC Comics as a whole, you have to get it right. And just kind of the mishandling of this character is all you really need to say, oh, maybe he's not the right guy to lead this franchise into the future. Doubling back to the whole jumping the gun topic that we had a few minutes ago, talking about how they tried to introduce too much without really setting it up. We also got Wonder Woman in this movie. Did she really need to be in this movie? Not really. Was it cool that she was in the movie? Yeah, it was pretty cool. Her scenes were alright. But aside from getting Wonder Woman for a little while as an actual character in the movie, you also got introduced to The Flash, Cyborg, Aquaman, albeit in security footage and archived files. But it's another instance, for me at least, of you're trying to introduce the entire Justice League in the second movie of the DCEU. I know that most of it is set up, like The Flash and Aquaman and Cyborg were all set up. But then again, you also have the future vision that Batman has of the Flash. Did they ever come out and say if that was a vision or if it was a dream or whatever? But yeah, you have that, and you're introducing what you would assume is Justice League in the second movie of the DCEU. You're doing way too much too fast. That's my opinion. I think that they really tried to shove way too much in there. Now, moving on from that, I have a complaint that's not really something that I'm gonna pin on any one person. I'm not the biggest fan of the Doomsday design from this movie. I feel like it could have been a little bit better. I feel like the DCEU and superhero movies of the time had a little bit better design work and CG for their, big non-human villains and heroes. I feel like we could have made him look a little bit better. But that's just me. Maybe that's a nitpick, but that's where I'm at with that. Another problem I have with this movie is the whole Batman branding criminals is kind of weird. It doesn't really feel very Batman. It feels more like a Punisher thing than a Batman thing. And that's part of the problem, is that Zack Snyder kind of wanted to make Batman more like the Punisher, killing and branding and this and that. And it just doesn't work for the character of Batman. It's just not who the character is supposed to be. And I know that it's addressed in the movie that that's not really something he should be doing. I believe Alfred says that that's kind of like a step out of the light in a way. But, you know, even at the end of the movie, he's almost branding Lex Luthor. So did he really learn anything? Or maybe him not doing it was that he learned something, but he still went there with the intention of doing it. So, I mean, you tell me. Another thing that isn't great about this movie, if you told me that this was your least favorite part of the movie, I wouldn't blame you. The whole Martha thing. Batman's beating on Superman, trying to kill him, actually trying to kill him. And then Superman says, "Save Martha," and then he just stops and acts all vulnerable. Why? Why was this a story point? Like, I know that his mom's name was Martha. I know that would probably get to him a little bit, but you are trying to kill this man. A man that you think could potentially be the greatest enemy Earth has ever seen. And then you're gonna stop because he says your mom's name? Like, what happens if his mom wasn't named Martha? If his mom was named Sarah, would you kill him? Are you that fickle that you hear your mom's name and then you go from, "I'm gonna murder you," to, "We're friends now"? Speaking of which, literally says, "I'm friends with your son" when he rescues Martha. And I know it was kind of, you know, yippee, kind of funny, but from an in-universe standpoint, like, that does not make any sense. Like, you were trying to kill this man, and then like 2 hours later or whatever, "I'm friends with your son." No, you're not. You are not. And last but not least, the biggest problem I have with this movie that isn't about Warner Brothers' overarching designs and plans for the DCU is Lex Luthor was severely miscast. I know that even some diehard Zack Snyder fans will agree with this. People who swear by the Snyderverse will agree with this. There are a few exceptions, but almost everyone can agree that Lex Luthor was miscast. Jesse Eisenberg had no business touching this role. And Jesse Eisenberg is a great actor, a really great actor. I've loved him in everything else that I've seen him in. But the problem is Jesse Eisenberg just isn't Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor is not whatever it is this was trying to be. Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor is exactly the same as when he played Mark Zuckerberg, but more evil. I mean, I don't know who decided this, if it was Snyder or some other executive producer or casting director or what have you, but this was just, I don't know what they were thinking. He doesn't really come off as powerful or scary or intimidating in this movie. He's just kind of annoying. But I guess I'm gonna wrap that topic up right now just because I'll be ranting about that for 10 minutes if I keep going. Since this is the first time I've rewatched this movie since the first time I saw it, about 8 years later, I honestly enjoyed this movie a lot more than I thought I would. I definitely enjoyed it more than I remember enjoying it the first time. And so let's talk about some of the positives, at least in my opinion, that this movie has to offer. As I said with Man of Steel, and with what I find to be the case in all Zack Snyder movies, it looks beautiful. The settings and most of the CG and the costuming all looks really good. Now I know that there's some complaints to be had about the dark tone that Zack Snyder always does, where everything feels kind of like gray and dingy and there's not a lot of bright colors. But if you just accept that aesthetic, or you know it ahead of time and you go into it already knowing it, I feel like it's more enjoyable. Kind of like this movie as a whole. I didn't have any expectations, so when I went into it, it was more enjoyable than the first time. If we're being completely honest, no matter how you feel about Ben Affleck as Batman, or the character of Batman in this movie, the warehouse Batman fight scene is one of the best Batman fight scenes we've ever had in live action. And it really does do a good job of showing the power behind Batman's strikes. And that's something I really enjoy. Because Batman is supposed to be someone who, for a human, is very strong and very skilled. I know he's not superhuman, but it does a good job of showing the power disparity between Batman, who's been training for decades now, and just some random thugs. And it's believable too, because when you saw Ben Affleck earlier in the movie when he was training with the tire, he looked really big. He really put in the work for this role to get, swole. One of the things I really enjoyed about watching this movie for the second time is all of the actors I didn't remember were in it. I remember Thomas Wayne was played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, but I didn't remember that Lauren Cohan, I believe that's how you say her last name, Cohan, I didn't remember she was Martha Wayne. And that's so odd to me now after seeing The Walking Dead. If you've seen The Walking Dead, you know that their characters in that show have a very interesting relationship, to say the least. So seeing them here again as husband and wife is so odd. It's so hard to separate those actors from their characters in that show. Also, how come when we're talking about actors and actresses who have been in both Marvel and DC projects, these two never come up? We've got one of the main bad guys in this movie whose name I don't remember, is one of the guys from Captain America Winter Soldier. He's like the second in command guy, and then you see him again in Endgame whenever they go to the past. And then also the actress that plays B-15 in Loki is in this for a brief scene. How come, do people just not remember this movie? How come these actors never come up when we're talking about these things? And then also the senator in this movie, the main lady, is played by Elastigirl's voice actress from The Incredibles. This whole movie, it felt like I was like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme. I was just... And then when I heard her voice, I was like, I know that voice. This whole movie was like an I Spy book with people that I know either from something else or I can't place them right away, but I figure it out during the movie. What the heck? So I will give this movie that. Aside from Lex Luthor, the casting was really good. And even the people that only had a few lines, a few scenes, everyone in this movie did a great job. In conclusion, this movie isn't great, but it's better than I remember. I had more fun watching it the second time. So, silver lining, I guess? This movie has deep, deep flaws. Some come from before the movie was even made. Casting choices, directional choices, and then there's others in the movie that were just on-set choices and decisions that weren't really great. At the end of the day, it's not a good sign when you have a movie this flawed, when you're trying to build a whole universe of movies. It's really no surprise that the DCEU didn't last as long as the MCU, and we're already getting a rebooted DCU in a couple years. This movie is definitely a step down from Man of Steel. And while it's still an enjoyable watch, you kind of have to lower your expectations. Don't expect anything great, and you might have a good time with this movie. But if you expect something great, this movie's not for you. As I stated in my Man of Steel video, I'm going through the DCEU as a whole, mostly in order, and then Zack Snyder's Justice League and Peacemaker will be at the end. And yeah, Suicide Squad is next, so who knows when I'll get to that. I have watched it already. Making a video, however, who knows when I'm gonna get to that. Probably soon-ish, hopefully soon-ish. But yeah, that'll be next. This is probably the last time in a while I'll be on brand. I bought this Batman hat like 12, 13 years ago, and I definitely haven't worn it in the past 10 years. I kind of forget that I had it, but I definitely don't have Suicide Squad merch of any kind. But yeah, until next time, bye.